Well, today in this video, I'm going to compare this pencil with this pencil. Both are water soluble. Both can be used with watercolor. This one has a slightly different claim to fame. Let's go find out what it is. Well, hello minders. Welcome back to The Mind of Watercolor. Well, I've been asked for years, oh man, going back probably to the beginning of the channel, to review these Derwent Inktense pencils. And today I will not be doing that. No, what I want to do is a comparison. And I have resisted because I've just not really known or had an idea how to fit these into what I do in my workflow or how I would use them. So I've just kind of put it off. And I have had this set now. This is the 72 pencil set. It's a beautiful set. I've had this for a couple years. I bought it, so I guess 2022 sometime. I mean, look at all those wonderful colors. I thought way back then I was going to do a review. You don't really need a review, okay? There's tons of reviews on this Inktense pencil, and they even have a watercolor pan set out now. And there's sticks. There's the watercolor sticks. So if you really like Inktense, it comes in different forms. I think I was most interested, if I was interested at all, in doing or looking at the pencils. And the way I'm going to approach it is, let's do a comparison. I want to fit these into my workflow, my style of use. So this is going to be a video on comparing them to watercolor pencils. In case you do not know, Derwent Inktense pencils are ink pencils. They are water activated pencils. So when you draw with them, write with them, color with them, and then go activate them, they turn into a wash, just like a watercolor pencil. The difference comes, they turn into an ink and become more permanent. Very intense colors, and the fact that they are ink, that is their claim to fame, not just watercolor. Now, the reason I want to compare is I want to see, because I would like to use these in a mixed media sort of framework. Now, watercolor pencils for me are a bit of a conundrum. How they are used can be a little confusing, and I've had a lot of questions about that. Well, how do you use them? What do you do? I do not like to use watercolor pencils as a painting medium. You can do it, meaning you go in and you just color, you draw and you color, and you can mix, you can layer and do all that stuff, and then activate it into a wash. I have done that. I don't really care to do that because it's just a more tedious process of what using a standard brush and paint will do. I like to use them as a drawing medium, a linear drawn medium. When and if I use watercolor pencils, I tend to use them for underdrawings, for paintings, or to add line work, which then allows me to sort of activate those lines and add a little tone to the edges. But I treat them as a linear drawing medium. And that's probably the way I'm always going to treat watercolor pencils. And I don't think it's going to be any different for these. Now, what I'm intrigued by is the ink possibility. So when you use ink in line and wash and watercolor, you have the opportunity to draw things. Again, if it's something that's water activated, you can add a little bit of tone. And then I would love to be able to come on top of that with washes that are not disturbing the watercolor pencil or the line that the Inktense pencils would make. Now, the reason I want to compare is I want to see, because watercolor pencils tend to have some amount of permanence. In other words, if I draw with them, activate them, or color with them and activate them, they tend to not be able to be lifted or moved much more after that. They do a little bit, so I want to test that degree. And I want to see how I would like this as a mixed media drawing solution for adding washes to later. I do this with wax colored pencils a lot. I use wax colored pencils like a line and wash because they don't move at all. They don't get disturbed by water at all. This could be similar in that if you activate it, you'd be able to get a little bit of tone. And then, it would not be disturbed after that, theoretically. So let's just see how that works. let's do some comparison tests first. You are seeing this real time. I have not done any preliminary testing or work with this at all. So I wanted to do this, and I figure, hey, I might as well bring you along for the ride, okay? It's time I figured out how and if I want to use these Inktense pencils. And by the way, how I use them don't have to have any bearing on how you use them, okay? If you do full painting with them, great, so be it. As a matter of fact, as we talk about Inktense pencils, put down in the comments if you use them, love them, how you use them, and what you have found to be your most successful or satisfying or whatever way of using them. That's going to help other viewers who are kind of making up their mind about this, deciding whether they want to use them or not. And I would be interested too, to know how they're being used out there. As for me though, I'm going to use them as a drawing medium with the possibility of toning. Now with watercolor pencils, I tend to use dark colors, because I use them like a line or as a line enhancement or drawing or a line and wash kind of approach. So I'm using a dark sort of a red brown here. It's actually, let's see, what is it? Red violet. I've got mauve, which is a purple. I've got this green, which is a deep cobalt green, and I've got a Van Dyke brown. Now I'm going to make a few swatches the way I would normally use watercolor pencil. I'm just going to draw some random drawing. I'll do some dark and some light coloring. Let's do a heavier coloring. Next color, let's go for the red. A little lighter, wispier colors. Do the mauve. One of the things I want to test, and we'll be doing that here, is the intensity change, because watercolor pencil, when you put it down, and you don't have to activate watercolor pencil when you draw with it. You can draw and just activate parts of it. So there's no rules, there's no laws about how you use them. But they do change drastically when you activate them with water. They grow quite a bit in intensity. I want to see how that compares. All right, finally, we've got the Van Dyke brown. All right, I've just got a little number 6 round here, nothing special. Got a water bowl over here, rag in my hand just to adjust my water. You know, same stuff as usual. Here's how I typically will use watercolor pencil. If I'm drawing, like if I'm using a heavy line or outline, I will do one of two things. I will come in and I will just activate the line, because I want the line, but I want it to reach its full intensity, but I also don't want it disturbed much afterwards. So watercolor pencil has the trait of when you set it in or when you activate it, it sets it in. Now, the other thing I will do is I will activate and shade in the darkest recesses as sort of an underpainting. So I might do some of this. And you can treat this video as a watercolor pencil technique video if you like. Learn a few tips for how to use it. So even if you're not interested, you can see how it can add interest to just drawing. So maybe we have some hatching here, some feathering, and I might do this. Watercolor pencil can actually be very useful as a drawing tool, just as a drawing tool. So you don't have to, completely think of it as a painting tool. I have to draw it all, I have to shade it all, I have to color it all, and then activate it into a painting. You don't have to do that. If you're sketching, I've done sketching before with watercolor pencil. I like to do the same sort of thing. It's just a little bit lighter in its treatment. Okay. Then, of course, there's the washes, and that's usually done like this, as you would shade with a watercolor pencil. And then I'll just go turn all of that into a wash. And I might do that. That's the light, and you can see how much more intense the color is after it's activated. I like Albert Dürer watercolor pencils because you can activate them and just completely do away with these drawn sort of textury lines. Not all watercolor pencils will do that. Some you can add as much water as you want and the line just does completely go away. You have the choice with Albert Dürer, so that's why it's always been my favorite watercolor pencil. All right, so that's activated into a wash. Let's do the same thing to the others. And usually I'm just using a damp brush, not a super wet brush. So we're just going to pretend and imagine that this is a drawing of something instead of sort of weird abstract lines that I have here. I like to bring tone away from the line for shading. It's a technique I use a lot. Sometimes I just and only activate the line. I know I'm being repetitive, but I want you to kind of get how it is I use these and how I'm going to compare the two. Our little light sketchy lines here. All right, let's activate the wash. And I want to activate it completely so there's no textural drawn lines for the sake of my comparison. Again, look at the difference between activated and unactivated. Quite a bit of difference in intensity. That's true with most watercolor pencils. You will get even more intensity out of some. Like if you talk about the museum Caran d'Ache aquarelles, they are super intense. That's a favorite with a lot of people, the aquarelles by Caran d'Ache. I don't really care for them because a lot of times they are not the color that they seem when you put them down. I like Albert Dürer's better. This is just sort of an aside because while they're more intense, they look like the color you put down. I find the museum aquarelles, a mouthful, a little harder to predict what you're going to end up with in color. So they are extremely intense. It's a really nice purple, this mauve here. And lastly, Van Dyke Brown. I actually use this color a lot for underdrawings. I've even used watercolor pencil to sign my paintings. However, if you do that, I really stress that you should take this step here. See how I'm just retracing the line and activating it? Just sets it in a little better. All right, so we've got those activated. We're going to let those completely dry. Let's go on and do some Inktense tests. All right, part 2. And I've picked similar colors. They may not match exactly. I don't care. But just so they're close. For the brown, they had a willow that looked like it might be close. I don't know. I have this red, which is called Shiraz. Sort of, this looks like it might be a little bit redder and not quite as burgundy, but we'll see. And I have a mallard green and a violet. So let us try these and compare. I can tell you one thing right off is I get a more buttery, softer laydown, which is interesting. Just feels like a softer pencil. It's a pretty close match on the color. Not that I was necessarily trying. Our light wash will be our heavy wash. A little bit darker red. All right, let's go to violet. Definitely a softer point because I'm breaking the tip off easily. Okay, and finally, the brown, the willow. That's pretty close, actually. And finally, the heavy wash, brown and brown. Let's see what we got here. Oh yeah, very intense activation. Not really a surprise. You get a lot of wash. And if I just want to activate a line, I'm going to try that. All right, let's see how complete the activation is. Pretty complete. I can activate all of it, pretty much undo or make the texture disappear. Definitely a more intense color, but they're not necessarily meant to match, so I'm not really concerned about intensity. Oh my, look at the difference here. This reminds me of Karen Dash, the way it goes down so muted. And then when you activate it, it's like, oh, whoa. That's like blood red right there. Crimson. You get a lot more wash for your activation. That's good and bad. If you're looking for that, that's fine. However, if, you know, it can take you by surprise and it can be unpredictable in the final result. So depending on what you're trying to accomplish, I mean, as a test, you could say, oh yeah, that's great. I get a lot more intensity and wash. Yeah, well, that doesn't always translate to better results, but it's something you can adjust for. You can keep your line lighter and, you know, just understand how much you're going to get when you activate it. I mean, I'm getting a pretty decent color wash out of that very light shading, you know, and whether you're using watercolor pencils or Inktense, one thing you're going to want to do is produce a swatch sheet for this very reason, because you just don't know what you're going to end up with otherwise, unless you have that. I use swatch sheets for watercolor pencils more than I do for regular watercolor. Kind of get used to watercolor and you know what you've got, but it can always end up being a surprise with watercolor pencils, or presumably these Inktense. It's getting really deep washes. This violet is not as red as the other one. Real curious how these lines are gonna do. If I use it as a line and wash, I may end up wanting to make a weaker or lighter line. Otherwise, it's just going to continue to activate afterwards, and then it won't be any different than watercolor pencil. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. I forgot to do the rest of this one. I suppose comparing them to Derwent watercolor pencils would have been better, except that I have a few, but I don't use Derwent watercolor pencils. I use Albert Dürer. So for me, this is the more appropriate comparison. A nice violet, very deep. All right, over here to Willow Brown, more yellow brown than the other one. Going to activate this line over here. And finally, our deep brown wash. All right, I need to make sure those are both completely dry. I'm going to do some wash tests over these, mostly over the line work, because that's how I'm thinking of using it. But let's give these a chance to dry. All right, and there's one other test that I want to do. Now, I've tried this before with watercolor pencil. It really didn't work out to my satisfaction, but we'll see on this. And that is, let me just draw some lines. And I'm just going to only use this one color. Okay, that's Inktense. This is Albert Dürer. Now, in my infinite wisdom, I thought, well, what if I wanted to draw a line, but I didn't want to go activate every inch of that line? What would just some mist do? Well, what it does is it makes it bleed, because I know I've tried it before. So I'll show you. It's actually kind of a cool effect if you're wanting it. And it will kind of activate and set that in. I'm only imagining it's going to do the same over here, but I want to see if it does it to the same extent. Pretty much. Okay. Just to leave no stone unturned. Well, I'm probably leaving a lot of stones unturned, but this maybe has crept a little more. You know, maybe I'll spray the whole thing. Because, again, in the interest of being able to turn this into indelible work, which does happen a little bit with watercolor pencil. It's hard to loosen up and move after it's dry. But in the interest of that, the idea of trying to make everything as activated as possible fits into the way that I want to use these. So let's just go for it, okay? I'm going to pick up any runs. So I got this running here, got this running here. So, I mean, if you're looking for interesting washy effects, that might be kind of cool. And I'm just tapping this into some of these drips so they don't run down. That's interesting. I mean, I'm already getting a lot more creeping and bleeding over here, which, I mean, you would expect watercolor versus ink. So that's good. I like the fact that while it is spreading, you can see the little halos and color glows, which again, if you're not opposed to a washy look, sort of an interesting wet and wet look, that could be cool, but these lines are staying intact a little better. So, and maybe now I have activated this to the point where when it dries, it's going to stay as well as it's going to, if that makes any sense. Let's let this thoroughly dry. All right, as you can see, I've got my watercolor palette out, and this is kind of the final test. First of all, let me just recap. Albrecht Dürers, love them. They act like watercolor pencils are supposed to act. They feel a bit harder, not as soft as these. And the Inktense definitely activates more intense. In other words, a greater difference from the initial line to the activation intensity. But that's always been what I've liked about Albrecht Dürers, is that I have a little bit more predictable result when I'm painting. Nevertheless, what I would use Inktense for, I think it's totally appropriate. I'm really glad that I did the total spray over because that told me a lot. The watercolor pencil just really didn't hold up well to that. Everything faded, ran. You had a little of that. There's some haloing, but more of it basically stayed put. And if it's going to be ink, that's what I would expect. So let us do some washes over this. And I'm mainly interested in these, which would be the line art, which I could then go over with sort of loose, washy, wet and wet background washes. So I'm going to make up sort of an orangey wash that contrasts with these colors. Something that's fairly light. I may also dab in some wet and wet. The color doesn't matter too much. I just want it to be different than these colors. Once I have my drawing, I might do this. That's staying put fairly well, but then I've pretty much activated it about as much as I can activate it. It's a little hard to tell. I am probably pretty confident that, and I'm going to rub this a little bit over here just to see. You see, I'm able to kind of rub some of this watercolor pencil out, which is not what I want to happen in this kind of usage. This is more staining, and you can see here, I've got green going into my wash. And it's what I would expect. Let's see over here if I get a cleaner result. So I'm not confident 100% of that line activated, and it didn't. It's a little bit disappointing. I won't say unexpected, but there's more of it staying. So, well, definitely a more usable result. Well, I did have some green, and that's got to have some phthalo in it. Did have some green. Didn't notice it as much here. I think there's probably a little red and that yellow there. This is a more usable result. So that is encouraging, and that's kind of what I was hoping and looking for. And I probably put the pencil down heavier than I would have if I was doing a finished piece. So it's instructive to think of it in that way. But this, I mean, this is just washing out way too much. Over here, most of this pencil got completely activated, so I shouldn't have any color traveling with the wash at all. And I don't see any. If it is, it's trace amounts. So it's going to depend on how much you activate. That's good. That tells me what I want to know. All right, everyone. I hope this was helpful. This was a curiosity I had, something I wanted to explore. I feel I would just bring you along with me. You saw me basically learn these things in real time, and now I know. And now you know. If you want to know, I will definitely be using Inktense in the future, so look for more videos where I actually do that. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, patrons, for the support of this channel, and we'll see everybody in the next video. Bye-bye.